Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our HoUSed call today. I'm Sarah Gallagher. I'm the Vice President of State and Local Innovation here at NLHC, and this is our National HoUSed Campaign call. As you know, our HoUSed campaign focuses on advancing anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale, sustained investments and reforms needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We've launched this campaign because we at NLHC recognize that more than ever, bold policies are needed to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and the most marginalized people have stable, safe, affordable homes. On our house call, we bring together advocates from across the nation, including homelessness and shelter service providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals, and receiving or in need of federal assistance, and people experiencing homelessness. We also bring together philanthropy and media to join us and talk together. Today, we have a really great call in store for you. We're very excited to welcome 4 great speakers. We have with us today Cecilia Reyes, who's a senior reporter at Business Insider, and Cecilia is going to talk to us about her reporting on illegal evictions. We have Antonia Fascinelli, who's the executive director at the National Homelessness Law Center, and she's going to provide updates since Johnson's versus Grant Pass decision. And we have Matt Noyes, Director of Public Policy at Citizens Housing and Planning Association, otherwise known as CHAPA. And he's going to share with us their advocacy strategies behind Massachusetts Affordable Homes Act. And then, of course, we'll get a policy update from our very own Kim Johnson at the Coalition, and she'll talk to us about what's happening in Congress and what we need to do to protect federal housing investments now and in the long term. Before we jump in, though, I just want to give a couple of reminders that if you have questions, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. That makes it much easier for us to follow the questions that you type in and than it is in the chat box. So please use the Q&A section of the screen. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, and we'll remind our speakers that also to try to answer some of the questions online if we can't get to them all verbally. So with that, I'm going to start us off with our first speaker and introduce Cecilia Reyes. Cecilia, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you about your reporting on illegal evictions.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I've been following this call for about 4 years now, since the start of the pandemic. And coincidentally, that is also where the idea for the stories I'm going to talk to you about started. So this summer, Business Insider published 3 stories on illegal evictions or lockouts. I'll be saying lockouts throughout this chat, but just know that it's a shorthand. And I'm talking about times that landlords change the locks, yes, but also do things like limit or shut off essential utilities or otherwise circumvent a state's legal process to evict a tenant through the courts. You also may have heard about these removals as self-help evictions. So back in 2020, I started hearing from tenants and organizers in Chicago that despite a moratorium on filing evictions, the removals were still happening. They were just happening off the books. I wanted to know how prevalent this type of thing was. There actually had been a survey done of legal aid organizations nationwide around this time, and they all reported that they were seeing an uptick in the use of these tactics, but there really wasn't much in terms of research that I could find on a national scale. So when we started taking a look at this, I looked at eight large cities with high renter populations. Because of the nature of these removals, it was difficult to track them directly. In fact, I remember in the process of reporting this, talking to one landlord group association who was telling me that it was hard enough to track displacement for legal evictions, let alone ones that occurred without all the paperwork that you might imagine is involved with an eviction. So I was really looking for any places where people might be reporting these type of tactics. One of those places was police records. So I obtained data, audio of people calling 911. 911 I did specifically because of the emergency nature of these types of things. And I also obtained body cam footage from some of the responding officers from different police departments. Where I could, I also got complaints sent to, for example, a housing agency, a city housing agency, and civil justice courts, knowing that for some people, calling the police may not seem like a tenable option, even in this situation. So what I found is that in cities where we had more than a year's worth of data on complaints, the volume was increasing across departments, it was increasing across jurisdictions and locations. I also requested police training on the types of guidance that officers would receive. And from looking at that body cam footage, I also found that, even in situations where officers seem well-intentioned and like they're trying to help, the actions that we were observing on body cam seemed almost improvised as far as the response that they would give to tenants. In New Jersey, for example, I looked at some records from Jersey City where the landlord who tries self-help is actually liable to go to jail for these types of situations. And there, a tenant who says she was locked out for multiple days and had her work uniform locked in the house and couldn't go to work was essentially told by a sergeant that she should break back into her house and basically shoulder the risk of the landlord pressing charges against her. In Las Vegas, so totally different part of the country, I also saw something similar where police officers told a mother and her daughter who had been locked out to essentially rely on the kindness of neighbors to take them in or go to a gas station to warm up, even though Vegas has a process where a tenant could get in front of a judge to get an order letting them back in after an illegal removal. So part of the difficulty in this project was getting records, especially from police departments. And I want to talk specifically about the departments and not individual officers, because part of what I observed as part of reporting this was a kind of attitude of this is not really something that we deal with, even in places where state or local laws specifically identify police departments as the enforcing agencies for stopping these kinds of removals. So I would hear things like, this is a civil matter where police's hands are tied. And that sort of attitude reflected ultimately on the data that we received, where on average, we found that an overwhelming majority of calls wasn't documented in a police report. An arrest in some cities where police officers had the ability to effect one were also very few and far between over the years we looked at. So even though nearly all of the states have statutes in the books banning these self-help evictions, the responsibility of enforcing rights to due process, I found, were overwhelmingly falling on the tenant, who in most cases has to sue to get some sort of recourse. And as you can imagine, somebody who is not gearing up for a legal battle, may not have the resources to take that on. One woman that I talked to in Atlanta, for example, she repeatedly represented herself against her landlord after her landlord shut off her electricity on her fiance, and their 6-month-old baby at the time. She eventually was able to get $250 from a judge for that constructive eviction. But by that point, she had 2 eviction suits under her name as her landlord filed and dismissed those cases in an effort to get them out. So as you can imagine, she was very frustrated by this outcome, even though she got a recognition from a judge that this had been illegal. And she's still, last I heard, looking for a permanent place for her and her now 2 young daughters to live. Um, I also looked at some places that had more than a lawsuit as a remedy for tenants who were locked out. But I still found that tenants were facing a disparate number of state laws that could be applicable to them. And the result of that was that landlords, the odds of them getting held accountable and for the tenants to get back in was still low. Take, for example, in Harris County, where at best, their process of getting somebody back inside their home was kind of a coin flip. So there was a 50-50 chance. By contrast, in Chicago, uh, only 1 in every 140 lockout calls resulted in a fine to the landlord. So very different types of outcomes there. We also wrote about people who were quote unquote informally housed. So we talked to people who were living in an unpermitted unit on a landlord's backyard, for example, in an RV, in a single family home that had been converted into different units. And people who were living in a motel, not intending to treat it as a transient location, but who were in fact living there. So even if the laws spell out when people are supposed to get the rights of tenants, their stories to me really highlighted that they remain vulnerable to things like an eviction without due process, like a lockout. I do want to say that the landlords who spoke to me as part of reporting this said that they hadn't broken any laws or they hadn't meant to, which again to me highlights the importance of having a knowledgeable, a well-trained third party decide these types of cases, especially when the stakes are so high as to involve somebody being suddenly homeless. So another thing we found is that despite this consensus on banning lockouts across the nation, there was still like a patchwork of state laws on what exactly a state would consider legal, for example. So in New Jersey, which I mentioned, threats to remove a tenant are included, for example. But in Texas, to offer a different sort of example, there's even a carve out for certain landlords to use a lockout as a way to get a tenant to pay their rent. So very different definitions of what's included. And there's also a very wide variety on how much a tenant can recover, with some states naming a ballpark amount, which was as low, we found, as $250. So what else did we find? So what did we find after this deep dive? Just to conclude, because I know I'm running out of time. One, it doesn't seem to be a thing of the past. Two, police who can be on the front lines of responding to these emergencies appear undertrained on what they can or are supposed to do. And there's still a patchwork of state laws that govern these types of removals, and very few states offer tenants what they arguably want the most, which is to either reverse that lockout, get back in, or be made whole. So I'll leave that there. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this. And thanks again for putting this information on the screen, because we are very much still continuing our work on this. And I'm focused right now on looking at the practices of some corporate landlords, which if you will, hopefully, hopefully everybody will go read the series, but we did mention them and what they have done in terms of this topic as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for this. And thank you for sort of highlighting this often like hidden crisis. We hear a lot about sort of formal evictions, and even that data is hard to track. And I just really appreciate your deep dive into the lockouts and informal evictions, especially since you said there's so little data, and talking to folks is really, really important to hear their experience. So this is really, really wonderful to hear. A couple of questions for you. One is, you've kind of looked in, you mentioned at the beginning, sort of it's hard to track this information because there's so little data about it. And you talked about the police records that you looked into in some other sources of information. we often get the question of like how many informal evictions and lockouts are there? What would be your advice to other folks who are trying to look at this within their jurisdictions? What would be a first place to start looking for the information, and what important either sectors or data sets should they be looking at to dive into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the takeaways from looking at the police data is that despite what departments initially told me, which was this is not something we deal with, you're not going to find anything, is that they are indeed receiving thousands of calls about this. So my answer also kind of depends on who this person asking this question is, because somebody who's working in city government, for example, could decide to implement some sort of classification for these calls that police are getting. So I'll say, for example, in Chicago, there was an actual code for how to classify people calling into 911 about a lockout specifically, and this made it a lot easier to track, whereas in other places, in other police departments, even though they were still getting these calls, they would fall under things like disturbance or just a broad landlord tenant category, which can involve, to be fair, things that are not, illegal in nature. So, if you're working in city government, I would say like the data is already there. And I think it requires that extra step of classification, but you're gonna be able to find information there. If you're not, then I would advise to look at kind of somewhat of the usual suspect, so to speak. Like I try to put myself as much as possible into the shoes of somebody who was going through this emergency, and in talking to people, like calling police, certainly because it was an emergency in nature. But for other people, it made more sense to contact their housing agency, for example. So in Los Angeles, I did both. I went to the police and I also went to the housing department to get some of the complaints that people had been filing there. So I would recommend those two for
Perfect.
sure.
That's great. Thank you. And then the second question that came up was, you talked a little bit about, banning lockouts. You talked about sort of police training, and then sort of the patchwork of state laws. And my question, or that can really be there to protect renters. So I guess I'm wondering, through your interviews and through your work, did you find any themes on either the rights, protections, or resources that are needed sort of above and beyond the things that you mentioned that would really help prevent these illegal evictions, things some of our maybe advocates, state and local partners and tenant leaders should be thinking about advocating for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not really in the business of coming up with the solution
Mhm.
myself.
Okay.
I do know, of the quote unquote solutions that we looked at, or alternate like systems that I looked at. One of them that really caught my eye was again in Texas, where tenants are able to file something with the justice courts to speedily get in front of a judge. And this can happen ex parte. So in contrast to Nevada, for example, which I also looked at, the tenant doesn't have the burden of serving their landlord or of having, I think there's still some timeline requirements involved in the process, but you don't get as many cases fall through the cracks because people don't know how to serve, for example, or because they don't know which form to use. So it really was an interesting way to allow somebody who may be unfamiliar with how to file something in an emergency to get seen by somebody as quickly as a day, I saw when I looked over those records, and to get an order that is enforced also by the court's officers. So
Mhm.
after that order, if the landlord doesn't contest it within a certain amount of time, somebody else shows up to the property manager, the owner, and says, hey, you need to let this person back in. And like I said, even though the 50-50 odds may not sound so great, when I looked at other programs, it was actually the best one. So I think having that focus again on like what the tenant really needs in that situation, which is to get back inside their home. I think devising a process in which they're very much involved in the adjudication of what may have occurred in case to case, with the focus of getting them back inside, is definitely the way to go.
Great. Wow, fabulous. Thank you so much, Cecilia. This has been really interesting. I know there's a lot of conversation in the chat. I would love it if you could take a look at that and see if there's anything that you can address. But we really appreciate you being here and look forward to your series and learning more from you. So thank
No,
you.
thank you. Yeah.
Great. All right, so thank you, Cecilia. So our next speaker today is Antonia Bassinelli, who I mentioned is the Executive Director at the National Homelessness Law Center. And Antonia is going to talk to us about updates since the Supreme Court case of Johnson versus Grant Pass decision came out over the summer. So welcome, Antonia, and I turn the microphone over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And Cecilia, thank you so much for your presentation. I do have slides. So while those are loading, wonderful, and we can switch to the first slide, I will be talking a little bit about what the aftermath has been looking like post the Supreme Court's decision in Grants Pass. Just to level set for a moment, Johnson versus Grants Pass was a case out of a small town in Oregon called Grants Pass. And it was a case related to the town's interest in issuing tickets and fines and citations to unhoused people who were sleeping in public places, either in a vehicle, in a public parking lot, or in a park with a tent and blankets and pillows. And the question that the Supreme Court considered was whether issuing those tickets and fines and citations was unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment because Grants Pass lacked any public shelter. And next slide, please. Unfortunately, for our movement, and particularly for any person who is unhoused, the Supreme Court found that the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment, protection and prohibition did not stop towns like Grants Pass from issuing tickets and fines and citations. It did not stop them from punishing unhoused people, even when no shelter is available. What the Supreme Court said was that there certainly might be some other provision of the Constitution or some other law that may prevent jurisdictions from issuing tickets and fines, but the Eighth Amendment doesn't stop them. And that if someone who is unhoused is punished and they have no shelter that they can access, their recourse is to raise the lack of shelter as a defense in the criminal proceeding that they will have to endure once they are punished. Unquestionably, this was a horrific decision, and I think is one of several that will go down in history as a dark period for our Supreme Court. So what are we all doing about that? So we're going to move to the next slide. So I'm going to share a little bit about how local elected officials, state and local elected officials, are responding to the Grants Pass decision. And we're going to start with the local electeds who very bravely are holding the line against punishment. So we can move to the next slide. I hope we all know, but it's worth emphasizing and raising up that Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass very publicly came out the same day as the decision, stating very clearly that the Supreme Court's decision should not be used as an excuse by municipalities to arrest their way out of homelessness, and that housing is ultimately the solution to homelessness. I raise this up because she has made this statement in a state whose governor is taking the opposite position, and she's doing this very bravely and courageously to hold the line. So she really continues to be so important for the movement, and a real leader in this space. Next slide. But she's not the only one. So I wanted to share some of what we're seeing from around the country. So in addition to Karen Bass's statement, Los Angeles County doubled down on a policy that they had before the grants pass decision, but they reiterated that it will continue to be their policy that they will not jail unhoused people for simply being homeless. The South Bay City Council created a pledge asking jurisdictions in their catchment area to not aggressively criminalize. And San Rafael and Tuolumne County have both looked at having sanctioned encampments and safe spaces for people to stay. In the state of Pennsylvania, state legislators have indicated an intention to codify the Martin protections. Martin refers to the case before grants pass that first found Eighth Amendment protection for unhoused people who were arrested for sleeping in public. And so there's a group of legislators that intend to codify those protections in state law in Pennsylvania. And Pittsburgh has stated that it will not be enforcing its anti-homeless ordinances. In Washington State, Kitsap County recommends no change in their actions or laws following the grants pass decision and to continue to invest in services. And in Springfield, Illinois, a camping ban that was introduced was actually tabled in the face of opposition. So there are some good things that are happening. Now to turn to the not good things that are happening. Next slide, please. And we can jump to the next one there. Okay. So just since the decision in grants pass, which was the last week in June, so just over 2 months ago, 35 municipalities have already passed legislation to criminalize homelessness. This is new legislation to criminalize homelessness. Of course, we know there were many jurisdictions prior to grants pass that were attempting to do this. This is just since the decision at the end of June. And of course, one statewide action that was in the state of California, that was Graham Newsom's executive order, leveraging his role as governor to put pressure on local governments to destroy encampments of unhoused people, whether or not they had shelter or housing available. But here's the list. So in Arkansas, 2 municipal ordinances. In California, 15 municipal bills or actions. In Illinois, 3, Indiana, 1, Minnesota, 2, Montana, 1, North Dakota, 1. Next slide. New Hampshire, 1, New Mexico, 1, Oregon, 2. This includes grants pass, which has doubled down on its bans, increasing its opportunity created by the Supreme Court. I want to note that grants pass also created a segregated area where unhoused people could camp, and the word from residents in grants pass is that segregated area has become horrific. It is the only place where people can stay and avoid punishment, and conditions have deteriorated significantly. In Texas, 1 municipal ban. In Washington, 2 municipal bans. Wisconsin, 1, West Virginia, 1, and Wyoming, 1. And so that's just in 2 months. The effort to double down on punishment is clearly growing. It's not just on the West Coast, it is all over the country. Next slide. So, what are we doing? So, many of you who were following all of the work of the national organizations may have been following our website, johnsonvgrantspass.com. And through that site and through a number of organizations, including the Low Income Housing Coalition, which raised this up, we made an ask of $356 billion as a federal down payment for housing investment to simply address the immediate crisis of homelessness in the country. You can learn more about it by going to johnsonvgrantspass.com/solve-homelessness and learn more about that ask. That ask is really a framework for the kind of investment that we need to create enough housing for everyone in this country. And many of the components in that federal ask are part of the Low Income Housing Coalition's HoUSed campaign components. So we really appreciate the partnership there. In addition, I mentioned before that the Pennsylvania legislators are looking to codify the protections that existed before the Grants Pass decision. We do have a template bill that they are using for that codification, as well as a number of other jurisdictions. And Sarah, I see you. I will wrap it up, sure. You can go to our website, housingnothandcuffs.org/Gloria Johnson template legislation, and pull that down if you're interested in having your municipality or your state legislature consider that particular piece of legislation. Next slide, and I'm almost done. In addition to this great conversation and call we're having today, there's also cross-movement collaboration happening. In particular, leaders from the movements to decriminalize mental illness and substance use are going to be convening in DC on November 18th and 19th to talk about pushing back on this wave of punishment. Also encourage everyone to go to nchj.org, which is the National Coalition for Housing Justice, that the Low Income Housing Coalition, the Law Center, and other national organizations participate in to organize our policy strategies. Next slide. And then at the Law Center, we are working with the Western Regional Advocacy Project on the West Coast to create community-based legal defense clinics for unhoused people who are punished and need legal representation, which is often very difficult to get for low-level misdemeanor cases. Next slide. And that's it. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I wanted to offer up the email of my colleague Eric Tars from the Law Center, who is heading up the efforts with the State Gloria Johnson Act. I should also mention that there is going to be a federal companion bill as well, introduced in the Congress. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about that too. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. No, thank you so much, Antonia, for that update. It's really important to keep abreast of what's happening since this is a really historic decision. Some not so good, but some really, I think, bright spots too. So I appreciate that. A couple questions have come in, and I just want to say too, thank you for your organization, for your organizing and all of your tireless work on this effort. You've really helped create a movement and revitalize a movement. So really appreciate you guys leading that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your partnership.
Yeah,
really.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So question, you touched on one of the questions that came in. You mentioned the model legislation that you're working on, but folks, I think, are really curious of what model legislation is out there, or even policies that are not legislation can states and localities use to really rebuke the Grant Pass decision and can be used in more of a proactive way instead of a reactive way. And if you have any recommendations on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think our primary strategy for proactive is to get that Gloria Johnson Act out as quickly as possible before your locality starts to pick up on this wave, for sure. But if they have already picked up on it, one of the things that the Law Center does is really help push back on harmful pieces of legislation like the ones that I listed out here, which are primarily anti-camping laws that come with fines and fees, right? Just exactly what we saw in Grants Pass. And so within actually a couple days of the decision in Grants Pass, Nashville, Tennessee was picking up on a particular piece of legislation. We do letter writing, we meet with legislators, we can help try to talk them out of that particular strategy, which often we see legislators picking up because they want to respond to what they call constituent concerns, and they don't really have another tactic to take. And so we can try to walk them out of it, including using other legal arguments, just not the Eighth Amendment. And then say, listen, you really need to pass something like the Gloria Johnson Act, or take some other specific steps that are often specifically designed for that locality. So please reach out to me, reach out to Eric, if you need that kind of sort of local approach, and we'd be glad to support you.
Great. Thanks so
Yeah.
much. There's a few other questions in the chat, and then there's one here in the Q&A, which I'll just, it seems more of a suggestion than a question, but the question is,
sure.
has a law center considered doing a Cities Against the Criminalization of Homelessness campaign, really engaging mayors from all over the country to pledge their support to housing first in one space in time and manner? Is that something that would be useful or of interest?
I love it.
All right, Hale, we might reach out to you since that was your question to dive in deeper.
Yeah.
Antonia, thank you so much for being with us here today. And if you have a chance to look at the chat and provide some feedback, that would be great.
And thank you everyone who's put stuff in the chat. I'm going to cull through it right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, so now it's my honor to welcome Matt Noyes, the Director of Public Policy from Citizens Housing and Planning Association. Matt, are you with us today? There you are. Welcome. And you're going to talk to us about your advocacy strategies behind Massachusetts Affordable Homes Act, right? I'll give you the floor. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sarah. So thank you all for having me here today. I want to talk a little bit about a large piece of housing legislation that was passed earlier this year, last month, here in Massachusetts, the Affordable Homes Act, which is also known as our Housing Bond Bill. Every 5 years, the legislature has to pass a bond authorization legislation to allow the governor to issue bonds to borrow for the purposes of housing development in the state. And our previous bond bill passed in 2018 was due to expire. And so last October, Governor Healy introduced a housing bond bill known as the Affordable Homes Act, that in it at the time had the largest proposed bond authorization in Massachusetts history. So by comparison, 5 years ago, the bill passed by the legislature had $1.8 billion in bond authorization. Governor Healy's legislation had $4.2 billion in her proposal, which we were incredibly excited about. When the dust settled after the legislature had their work done on the bill, the final result was a $5.1 billion bond authorization here in the Commonwealth, which was wonderful. At this time, I always feel the need to put a little bit of cold water on that because, as we all know, $5.1 billion in 2024 does not buy nearly as much housing as $5.1 billion would have in 2018. We've seen costs go up. We've seen the cost of construction rise significantly in recent years. But still, given the options, I will take $5.1 billion over a much smaller number. So we're moving in the right direction here in Massachusetts, which we're excited about. Our bond authorizations are divided up into a number of programs, probably close to 20 different programs. And this time around, Governor Healy introduced some new programs to address very specific needs in our housing market here in Massachusetts. So in addition to proposing increased authorizations for a number of different programs, she had new authorizations for green housing, for community planning grants. But some of the things that we're most excited about is, for the first time, we had a bond authorization for a program called Commonwealth Builder, which is a program designed to create home ownership opportunity for minoritized communities who have been shut out of the home ownership market in Massachusetts for far too long. In addition, she included bond authorization for a new program called the Momentum Fund, which is designed to provide resources for mixed income housing projects that have been stalled, and to get those across the finish line to continue the momentum, shall we say, to continue those moving forward. So we're really excited about the bond authorizations in the bill, and it was a lot of work getting this through. And previous bond bills that have been passed, we've been strong advocates in the housing community to have a so-called clean bond bill, one free of policies, just the strict bond authorization in there. This time around was something different. Governor Healy, in addition to the dramatic increases in bond authorization, also put forward new tax credits, put forward new policy proposals, more than 20 policy proposals, which was a risky proposition because with policy proposals, a lot of times they become controversial, and that can delay the process of getting things through. And we ran into a very real risk of a bill not passing and having a gap in funding rounds. In the end, this came right down to the very last legislative day. The way our legislative calendar works, the legislature cannot be in formal sessions after July 31st of an election year. The bill was passed at the very tail end of that legislative day. Technically, if you had a watch, you would notice that it was actually August 1st when it passed, but it was the July 31st legislative day. So some of the things that were included in there were some tax credits. Community investment tax credit was increased, a home ownership tax credit for the first time, a doubling of a historic rehabilitation tax credit that has been so useful in creating affordable housing options. And there was a whole range of policy proposals that made it across the finish line. The one that got the most attention in the process of advocating for this bill was a local option real estate transfer fee that would have allowed local municipalities to put an assessment on real estate sales above a certain threshold. The governor proposed $1 million, up to a 2% tax on the portion of the sale above $1 million. That at the end of the day was not included in the final version of the bill. We're excited about that as an opportunity to create new housing resources. There were significant forces in the real estate industry who came in opposition to that, and unfortunately that was not included. But I'll choose to focus on the items that were included in the bill. For the first time now in statute in the executive branch, we have an Office of Fair Housing and a Fair Housing Trust Fund, which is a really wonderful development, long, long overdue. We have a statewide housing plan for the first time. It's difficult to believe that we never had on our books in Massachusetts a requirement to develop a plan of where we're going with housing development. And so we actually have that now that's begun. The governor started that under executive order, but that will continue in perpetuity, along with goals that are set forward. We have now accessory dwelling units, ADUs, that are allowed by right in all municipalities in single family zones, which is a really great opportunity for us, taking our inspiration from other states, including California, that have seen this as being a real boon to the housing development. We have a supportive housing pool fund for individuals exiting homelessness who need supportive services at the same time, as a way to streamline that process of pairing housing and services together. We have eviction record sealing in certain cases so that individuals and families who have dealt with an eviction in the past don't have that following them around forever, and those records can be sealed for the first time. We have a number of commissions that are established. And normally I don't get excited about commissions, but I think this really presents an opportunity to move the dialogue forward when it comes to the work on housing for very specific groups. So we have an extremely low income housing commission that was set up, a commission on senior housing, and a commission on accessible housing for persons with disabilities and for seniors. In addition, we had a program called Healthy Homes that was included that helps with mold and asbestos abatement. And we have provisions to protect public housing tenants when our public housing authorities, our state public housing authorities, merge for the purposes of saving money on administrative costs. One of the things that we also included in this bill that was a result of a lot of advocacy was what was not included. And what was not included were attempts by certain members of our legislature to roll back our previous affordable housing law, Chapter 40B, that allows for circumvention of local zoning in cases where certain municipalities do not have at least 10% of the housing stock being affordable. There's always attempts to roll that back. There were amendments filed to both bills that would have done that. Really pleased that the legislature spoke overwhelmingly in rejecting those proposals. In addition, we have a fairly new law here we're calling the MBTA Communities Act, which mandates that certain communities in the eastern part of the state that are in our Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority catchment area, so public transportation, they're required to establish zoning of high density, more than 15 units per acre, at least 2 of those zones within a half mile of public transportation. We are seeing communities adopting that. We're seeing some pushback, and so there were some attempts in the bond bill to roll that back, to weaken, to undermine that legislation. Really pleased again that the legislature spoke overwhelmingly and pushed back on that. So this was a process of a lot of advocacy across the housing community, bringing a lot of new people to the table. What we're finding here in Massachusetts is really for the first time, the business community is really weighing in on this. We're hearing from a lot of our business folks who are saying that they're seeing housing as being a significant threat to the economic growth in the Commonwealth. And these are businesses with high-paying jobs. We're talking biotech, information technology, higher education, which really form the backbone. Healthcare in Massachusetts really forms the backbone of our economy. And these industries are having a hard time hiring staff and finding workers to come in. And so the business community has been weighing in. It's been really instrumental in moving our housing policy forward. It's great to have them on board. It's too bad that it's taken this extent of challenge to get to that point. But we're really pleased with the Affordable Homes Act. And now comes the very hard work of moving forward to implementation. So we're looking forward to continuing the momentum and keeping those groups together as we push forward. Thanks, Sarah.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. It's really exciting, and the breadth of this act is just so substantial. It's really impressive. So thank you for your work on that. I think you talked a little bit about the question that came up is sort of when you talked about this was a shift, that you had policies in there, a broad range of policies. And I guess the question is, when you made that shift, how did you sort of get stakeholders aligned, given the various, the breadth of the act and the bill, ensure that everyone was sort of voice was heard, and keep everyone aligned and pushing forward, given the range of issues from housing trust funds to tenant protections, and everything in between? How did you do that organizing strategy and keep everyone moving on the same page? And were there trade-offs you had to make?
I mean, I think a lot of the credit has to do to Governor Healy, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, and our new housing secretariat that we have. Secretary Augustus led that work. They really put it out there to say that this bond bill was going to be sweeping in its nature. It was going to include those policies. I think it was recognition that funding alone was not going to move us forward and get us where we need to be. And so Governor Healy put down that marker and said, come along with us. We didn't get everything that was in there. We got a lot of what was in there, which was important. There was an ongoing process of engagement. The secretary literally went town by town across the Commonwealth, really selling this bill. We worked with them. Stakeholders worked with them. They were very open to suggestions that we had and opportunities to improve the bill. They were very open to that all throughout the process. The secretary was very open to the fact that there's no such thing as a perfect piece of legislation. Was willing to see improvements, and the legislature worked with us. And I think it's refreshing to see housing that high up on the agenda. Governor Healy's indicated this is her top priority. And she is really staking a lot on her administration to address the challenges that we have.
That's great. That's great to have that leadership for sure. And then you talked a little bit about implementation. Can you just talk a little bit about, what do you who will be leading the implementation? Will all that engagement continue? And are there things that you think rise sort of top of mind of what's needed for successful implementation?
Yeah, there's a lot that's going to go into implementation. It's a 100+ page bill with, in addition to all of the funding areas that would require a lot of work around bond authorization and raising our bond cap, new bond programs that are going to be rolled out and how those will work. And then all these new policies as well, these new laws. Accessory dwelling units are a wonderful opportunity. There are opportunities for municipalities to put certain limits on those, and the phrase in the laws is reasonable limitations. Now, how do you define reasonable? An opportunity that our executive branch may issue guidelines on that. So there's a guideline process. Setting up a supportive housing pool fund, which is so important. We're looking at a new Office of Fair Housing. At the same time, we have an executive branch hiring freeze. So how's that going to work? There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of opportunities, a lot of danger, but we are very fortunate that we have a strong advocacy community and a very open administration and a legislature that has been working on this and recognizes the issue. So we have a nice collaboration. Massachusetts is a small state in certain ways, and which does have certain advantages for sure.
Absolutely. Well, we guys got quite a piece of work ahead of you, but great job. And we really look forward to seeing what comes out of it and how it all progresses. Matt, thanks for being with us today and for sharing. I think there's some additional questions in the chat that you might want to take a look at. That would be great if you have some time, but we really appreciate you being here. Wonderful. All right, now I will introduce our very own Kim Johnson. And Kim, you're going to tell us all about what's going on in Congress right now. Take it away.
I am indeed. Thank you so much, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and it's my pleasure to be here with you. So like Sarah said, we're going to jump on into Hill updates. Congress is back from its month-long recess in August for 3 weeks, and they have those 3 weeks to pass a continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded and avoid a shutdown at the end of the month. The federal fiscal year is on a bit of a weird schedule where the new fiscal year begins on October 1st of every year, and so it ends on September 30th of the following year. So we are going to be pressing right up against that deadline. Once October rolls around, Congress is going to once again be in recess in order to keep campaigning right up to the elections in November. So these next 3 weeks are going to be a bit of a packed schedule, with Congress doing a lot of dancing back and forth and dramatics in order to get the CR passed. It is, however, despite the dramatics, still expected to pass, and we are expected to avoid a government shutdown. It's just a question of what the outlines of that continuing resolution agreement are going to look like. So we saw on Friday, Speaker Johnson in the House release a continuing resolution proposal that would extend federal funding until March 28th of next year. That proposal also includes the controversial SAVE Act, which would mandate that states require in-person proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. That proposal also does not include a $12 billion addition needed to cover a gap in VA medical care funding. And it includes $10 billion for disaster relief plus access for FEMA for upfront appropriations. So that totals to about $30 billion for disaster relief. There is a vote scheduled in the House for this week, or there will be at some point. However, even if that bill does pass the House, it is not expected to pass the Senate, and that is because the Senate is controlled by Democrats, and Democrats have issues with many of the provisions in this continuing resolution, the SAVE Act, but the one that we're really going to drill down into is the length of the continuing resolution, and we'll talk about why that matters. Could I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So the length of the continuing resolution matters because continuing resolutions extend the current level of appropriated funding for a specified period of time. So this would extend funding for 6 months, but because the cost of housing and homelessness programs rise every year, we need to see increased funding from year to year in order to just maintain the number of people being served by HUD's vital programs. And so because continuing resolutions maintain that flat level of funding, they essentially act as a cut to HUD programs. And so what we're really looking for is a continuing resolution that will probably take us after the election, of course, but that will still end sometime before the beginning of the new year. Next slide, please. And so to that end, in the run-up to the end of the year, NLIHC is going to be really strongly focused on ensuring that we get the most money possible in a final FY25 budget agreement for HUD and USDA's affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs. We have a number of resources that we would like advocates to use in order to push Congress for a shorter term continuing resolution and a final FY25 funding bill with increased funding for affordable housing and homelessness resources. So some of those resources are Take Action page. If you just have a minute, you can shoot Congress an email or encouraging them to provide increased funding in FY25. You can also specialize that email or give them a call and tell them about the importance of affordable housing, homelessness, and community development resources in your communities, in your family, or how those resources impact you. I saw a lot of comments in the chat earlier just referring to the kind of perceived disconnect that some members of Congress or the federal government have with their constituents. And I think that really highlights the importance of communicating with your members so that they understand the necessity of these resources. To that point as well, we also encourage folks to share their stories and share the stories of experiences with homelessness and housing instability. Storytelling adds an emotional weight to your message that can help lawmakers see how their policy decisions are impacting actual people. And so we have another resource that can help people put together a compelling story. And finally, we have an advocacy toolkit, Oppose Dramatic Cuts to Federal Investments in Affordable Housing. And that toolkit includes resources and talking points, advocacy ideas, and other helpful information about how people can take action in order to defend funding for affordable housing and homelessness resources and ensure we get the most funding possible. And so that is it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm going to turn it back on over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. And all those resources are over in the chat, so everyone can pop them up, and we'll also send them out in a few days via email. Kim, I don't see any questions in the chat for you, so I think you did a very thorough job. Thank you for your update. I appreciate it. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for being here. Like I mentioned earlier, all of the PowerPoints and the materials and slides will be sent around via email in a few days, so you'll have access to all of those resources and links that we shared today. I want to thank all of our speakers for being here. Really great presentations and information for all of us. And we look forward to seeing everybody on our next HoUSed call, which will be on Monday, October 14th, from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you everyone for being here, and always reach out to any of us if you have any questions or for more information. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.